colleagues, graduate students, and other attendees. I'm Richard Taylor of the Philosophy Department at Marquette University in Milwaukee and the De Wolf-Mancion Center for Ancient, Medieval, and Renaissance Philosophy at the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. Welcome to our program entitled The Christian West and the Islamic East Lecture Series. These 7 presentations are a collaboration of the Templeton-funded project, The Christian West and the Islamic East, Theology, Science, and Knowledge, organized by John McGinnis and Billy Dunaway at the University of Missouri at St. Louis, and also by the Aquinas and the Arabs International Working Group, an organization of over 70 scholars of philosophy in the Abrahamic traditions. These lectures by experts in medieval philosophy in Arabic, Latin, and Hebrew, and in the philosophy of religion from the US, Germany, France, Turkey, Israel, and Morocco, began this fall with the October presentation by Billy Dunaway of the University of Missouri at St. Louis. Today we have our second lecture in the series by Professor Nadja Germann of the Universität Freiburg. After today's lecture, the series will take a pause until 19 January 2021, when Dr. Christina Sarami of the CNRS in Paris will present. The series will then continue monthly through May. For more information, please see the series website. The purposes of these lectures are several. First, we want to share broadly our understanding of philosophy and religion in the Abrahamic traditions. Second, we want to encourage the use of valuable tools of philosophical analysis in the study of the Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions of the Middle Ages for the benefit of historians of philosophy and theology, and for the benefit of modern philosophers of religion today. Third, we want to reach out to philosophers and their students today to collaborate in the sharing of philosophical and religious understanding across international and religious boundaries for the sake of shared enrichment in our intellectual work. And fourth, with the website containing links to the video lectures and the planned publication of articles based on the presentations, we intend to share our work even more broadly into the future. These recordings will be valuable tools for student groups such as those with us today from the course of Professor Isabelle Moulin at the Université de Strasbourg, students in the collaborative graduate course on Aquinas and the Arabic tradition that Professor Andrea Robilio and I are now teaching at Marquette University and the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, and other student groups from around the world. Given that our time is limited today, let me provide just a short introduction of our speaker. Professor Dr. Nadja Germann took her PhD at Tübingen University in 2005, and then had a series of research positions and teaching positions in Leuven, Freiburg, Boston, New Haven, Baltimore, and Geneva, before taking a position at Albert Ludwig's Universität Freiburg. While her work began in the Latin tradition, she became a widely recognized expert in philosophy in the lands of Islam as well, with particular expertise in Al-Farabi and Avicenna. Much of her recent research has focused on philosophy of language and logic in the Arabic Islamic tradition of thought, epistemology, and metaphysics. Her presentation today is entitled, Meanings Can Only Be Attained Through Language, Philosophy of Language in Early Islamic Thought. We now ask you to connect to the link found in the Zoom chat area for the recording of Professor Germann's lecture. The video is 58 minutes. The live discussion will begin on Zoom at approximately 10 minutes past the hour. Please keep your Zoom connection live while you watch the video via your browser. So enjoy.
Hello, everybody. Thanks a lot for inviting me to giving this lecture. And thanks a lot for your interest in my research on philosophy of language in the Islamic world. Let me begin with 2 preliminary notes. So first of all, this paper is based on a book project. So it is based on material that I've researched in relation or in connection to this book. And second, the talk itself is a sequel to a couple of presentations I gave earlier this year. One in Groningen a month ago, and another one in Bob Hasnow's colloquium this spring, which some of you may have followed. So there is some thematic overlap, but it's in a way it's an attempt at elaborating on a specific aspect I would like to bring out. So let's get started. In this presentation, I will focus on what may be called the formative period of Arabic Islamic intellectual culture, that is approximately the 9th to 12th centuries, and here in particular on the 10th century. Moreover, as indicated in the title of my presentation, I will look into philosophy of language. However, in order to prepare the ground, let me mention a few general factors determining the context within which philosophy of language emerged. First, the Quran. For our purposes, it is important to know that the Quran, Islam's holy scripture, revealed during a period stretching from 610 to 632, was considered as God's own speech, that is, as a literal quotation. Furthermore, as is well known, the Quran was originally revealed in Arabic. In other words, God's own speech was delivered in a specific human language. At first glance, one may suppose that these convictions were issues for theologians and have not much to do with our topic, philosophy of language in the sense of human language. However, just as natural science and specifically evolutionary theory have a great impact on how we think about language nowadays, so did the Quran and the lessons it purports or implies in the early Islamic culture. Even if they were not addressed directly, the convictions that God had spoken to humanity and that he had used Arabic to do so were in the background of any sophisticated discussion around language. They called for particular consideration of at least two major problems. On the one hand, and this is noted here as A, the linguistic exchange between God and humanity. Every metaphysically well-grounded theory of language had to offer an explanation of how a transcendent being, namely God, could successfully communicate with human beings, of how it was possible at all for him to bring across some sort of message to humanity. As an effect, every meaningful philosophy of human language had to be anchored within a larger metaphysical theological framework, or more precisely, within a more comprehensive semiotic theory bridging the gap between the human and the divine spheres. On the other hand, the specific nature of Arabic language, that's B on the slide. According to the Quran, God had not simply spoken language or humanese, but a specific natural language, namely Arabic. This peculiarity raised the question of why God had employed the Arabic language and not another one. Certainly, from a modern point of view, this question looks quite chauvinistic and not particularly philosophical. However, it stimulated scholars to meticulously investigate the Arabic language and produce studies which, by virtue of the categories and concepts they apply, tell us a lot about their notion of language in general, its setup, its relation to thought, its mechanisms to signifying and eliciting understanding, its informative and performative dimensions, etc. So this would be the first and perhaps most important factor I wanted to mention, but there are a couple other ones. So second, the emergence of scientific disciplines. Since approximately the 8th century, a number of disciplines and scientific fields took shape, strongly inspired by the Quran and the teachings it had on offer for the young Islamic community. Foremost among these disciplines and fields were theology, philology, embracing both linguistics and lexicography, and what is often referred to as adab. And this is a core term which will recur, which is why I put it here on the slide in the different variations and derivations that I will use. So adab is briefly an encyclopedic kind of knowledge cum etiquette, perhaps most appropriately comparable with rhetoric in the ancient Roman culture. Within all these disciplines and fields, highly sophisticated reflections on language, in particular on the Arabic language, played a central role. For this paper, adab will be of special interest, since in contrast to theology, its primary interest was the human and not the divine speech, while in contrast to philology, its theoretical engagement with language was not restricted to the technical intricacies of grammar, like syntax, morphology, and phonology, but instead sought for an understanding of the phenomenon language in all its dimensions, including its metaphysical, semantic, and pragmatic aspects. And now the third factor, the reception of, among other cultural heritages, Greek philosophy. This reception was initiated by an impressive translation movement spanning the 9th and 10th centuries, in the course of which the entire oeuvre of Aristotle and a great deal of the late antique commentaries on Aristotle, along with the medical tradition, particularly Galen, and a number of Neoplatonic and Platonic texts or fragments were translated into Arabic. The concentration on Aristotle and the commentary tradition is important to notice, since it furnishes the principal basis of another scientific discipline or field that began to take shape during this period, Falsafa, that is, Neoplatonized Aristotelian philosophy. And this too, for those who don't know Arabic, I've put here on the slide, also with this, some of the major derivations that I will use throughout the paper. With respect to our topic, philosophy of language, this reception had the effect that the Arabic Aristotelians, who followed their late antique predecessors and commented extensively on Aristotle's logical writings, his organon, adopted both his concept of language and his specific view on the relation of language and thought. This Aristotelian notion of language, however, as we will see, was at odds with the conception of language developed by those scholars theorizing within the framework of adab. In view of this context, in my paper, I will focus on these two conflicting views on language, adab versus falsafa. My specific interest, however, rests on adab and not on falsafa for two reasons. First, due to various motives which are beyond our concern, research on Arabic philosophy was hitherto primarily devoted to falsafa and largely ignored other traditions, particularly adab. As a consequence, my contribution or my concentration on adab permits us to enter largely uncharted territory and shed light on an almost overlooked, though extraordinarily rich philosophical approach. And second, if one seeks to obtain an appropriate understanding of the nature and development of philosophy of language in the Arabic Islamic culture, it is, I believe, specifically adab and its critical engagement with and selective adaptation of falsafa that one must examine, because it is this tradition that most strongly affected the further course of philosophy of language in the pre-modern Islamic world. Accordingly, I will proceed as follows. In the first part, I will recap the relatively well-known basic features of the philosopher's philosophy of language to provide the background against which I can bring out the core features of the competing approaches developed in the frame of adab. The latter exercise will be at the center of the second and main part of my presentation. For time restrictions, I will focus on only two major issues, which I believe are fundamental for the Udaba's take on language and distinguish it from the philosophers. On the one hand, the metaphysics of language, on the other, the relation of language and thought. Now let's begin with falsafa. As mentioned above, the philosopher developed their philosophy of language and their conception of the relation between language and thought around Aristotle's few indications transmitted through his logical writings, the Organon. The key passage for Aristotle's ideas about the relation of words, thoughts, and things is the notorious first chapter of De Interpretatione, the following quote. Word spokens are symbols or signs of affections or impressions of the soul. Written words are the signs of words spoken. As writing, so also is speech, not the same for all races of men. But the mental affections themselves, of which these words are primarily signs, are the same for the whole of mankind, as are also the objects of which those affections are representations or likenesses, images, copies, unquote. On this account, there are things in extramental reality which, in one way or other, affect the soul of whoever perceives them. The soul is humanity's sensitive and cognitive center. It is responsible for both perception and thought, and receives its information, its input, by way of the external senses. It is notable that, according to Aristotle, extramental objects are the same for the whole of mankind, as he says here, and that the same is true for the affections or impressions they produce within the soul. In other words, Aristotle postulates a natural, and this is to say, a necessary and quasi-automatic link between extramental objects and their intramental representations or likenesses, images, copies. Impressions are what they are for whoever perceives the corresponding objects that cause them. Language, by contrast, is not the same for all people, because language, as Aristotle maintains a little later, is by convention, which is to say it is arbitrary and could be otherwise, and often is, as the multitude of natural languages evinces. See, for instance, next quotation from the second chapter of the Interpretatione. I quote, "We have already said that a noun signifies this or that by convention. No sound is by nature a sound. It becomes one, becoming a symbol. Inarticulate noises mean something, for instance, those made by brute beasts. But no noises of that kind are nouns." End of quotation. Without addressing the problem of how such a convention could have come about, Aristotle contends that vocal sounds are invested with meaning. They are somehow coupled with the representations or likenesses, images, copies, we saw in the first quote, established within the soul as a result of sense perception. Hence, in contrast to extramental reality and intramental concepts, there is no natural link between words and thoughts warranting that a specific word necessarily and quasi-automatically communicates a certain concept. To Aristotle's specialists, the overview I just offered certainly came across as somewhat coarse or simplistic. However, I believe it gives a fairly neat idea of the essential assumptions prevailing among the Arabic Aristotelians since approximately the 10th century, among philosophers like, for instance, Abu Nasr al-Farabi, who is pretty well known and whom I just evoke here for the sake of illustration. In order to provide a clear background of our main goal, the contrasting analysis of the concept of language in the Adab tradition, let me briefly list and outline the major points. First, thought literally represents or is an image of extramental reality, according to the philosopher. Concepts cannot be otherwise. They are the imprints or traces of things. Even though they are the imprints on one's own individual soul, they are not subjective. To the contrary, they are universal, shared by the whole of mankind, as Aristotle says, due to the quasi-automatic process of sense perception. Second, words or languages, by contrast, are not universal. They are particular and arbitrary, instituted or agreed upon by the members of individual linguistic communities. Therefore, the utterances belonging to another language are incomprehensible for foreigners, unless they underwent the effort and learned this language, word by word. For only then can these foreign symbols perform their function and lead the hearer to the concepts, that is, to the universally shared imprints or traces of things. Third, concepts or thoughts are primary. They are they are there in the mind as the result of sense perception and independent of the existence of language. Words, by contrast, are coined or instituted only secondarily, namely as vehicles designed to couch and transmit concepts or thoughts. This utterly instrumental view of language has the additional consequence that, according to Falasifa like Farabi, humans are supposed to be able to think, and to do so even in a complex manner without language. Fourth, on this account, signification, dalala, is a function. It leads hearers from the vocal sounds they perceive through the meanings, the ma'ani, these sounds possess due to convention, to the concepts the respective hearers have acquired through sense perception and then stored in their mental memory. In the inverse manner, signification guides speakers who seek to convey their thoughts from concepts through meanings to vocal sounds. Fifth, in this conception of language, meaning, mana, is perhaps the most problematic term, since it possesses a broad range of semantic shades, if it is not employed in an utterly equivocal manner. Regarded through the lens of the semantic triangle, the triangle of words, thoughts, and things, the term mana can signify, first, the intentional content of a concept that, second, corresponds to something in extramental reality, and third, is attached to specific vocal sound or several vocal sounds in the case of synonymy. In other words, every concept has or is a ma'na, and this would be the level of conceptual ma'na. Everything, property, or relation in extramental reality is a ma'na, and here we are on the level of real or maybe metaphysical ma'na. And last but not least, every vocal sound has or is invested with a ma'na, and this is the level of linguistic ma'na. It is by virtue of ma'na that, for Falasifa like Farabi, words, thoughts, and things are connected. With this background, let us now turn to adab, which is one of those disciplines or fields that emerged within the Arabic Islamic world a few decades prior to the reception of Greek philosophical teachings. Nonetheless, the Udaba were among those scholars who immediately and extensively engaged with the new concepts and approaches. Yet, in contrast to the Falasifa, they did not become straightforward adepts of the late antique scholastic tradition. Rather, they remained eclectic. They critically scrutinized the texts and teachings of Aristotle and his commentators, adopted what they found convincing, and rejected what they considered as wrong or problematic or not particularly useful. Their selective and independent manner of philosophizing comes to the fore the most lucidly within the frame of their reflections on language. On the one hand, some of their concepts and methods undeniably owe a lot to their interaction with the Falasifa. On the other hand, however, the Udaba's remarkable preoccupation with language, as well as the impressive array of facets and perspectives taken into account, clearly set them apart from the Falasifa. What results from these wide-ranging and at the same time detailed explorations of the phenomenon called language is nothing less than a fully fledged philosophy of language, some of whose principal features I intend to discuss in what follows. To prepare the ground, I will first broach a text that has already been studied by historians of Falsafa, a text written in the late 10th century that is presented as a debate between a linguist, a Nahu, and an Aristotelian logician. The focal point of previous studies was consistently the conflict between grammar and logic supposedly underlying this encounter. Accordingly, the text was read as the obviously biased report of a controversy about the benefits of logic in comparison to those of grammar, resulting in a glorious victory of the linguist. Regardless of whether or not this approach to the debate is particularly productive, I will take a different route. In the first place, I regard this text as a piece of literature deliberately designed by its author, the Adib Abu Hayyan at-Tawhidi, to put forth his own view on language and its relation to thought. For our topic, this debate is precious for two reasons. First, Tawhidi employs his view in explicit opposition, Tawhidi develops his view in explicit opposition to what he obviously perceived as highly problematic theories taught by the falasifa, our background model. Second, his position is strongly influenced by a specific track of thought among the Udaba that can be traced back to the famous Abu Uthman al-Jahil, one of the forefathers of Adab. Thus, following Tawhidi's lead permits us, for one, to identify those spots where the Udaba broke with and departed from the falasifa's conception of language, and on this basis, to pinpoint the building blocks, so to speak, the genetic code of the Udaba's own competing theory of language. A specific DNA that has distinguished this tradition throughout the formative period and probably beyond. The two protagonists of the debate are the philosophe, logician, and head of the school of Baghdad Aristotelians, Abu Bishr Mata, and Abu Sa'id as-Sirafi, an outstanding linguist who must be considered as Tawhidi's mouthpiece in this text. At the beginning of the discussion, the reader is confronted with the presentation of Mata's notion of logic. Since Mata's propositions remain the point of reference throughout the text, we must look at them more closely. There are three statements that articulate Mata's take on logic, and here they are in the order in which they appear in the text. I quote, first, "It is impossible to distinguish what is correct from what is incorrect, truth from falsehood, except by means of logic." Second quote, "I," this is to say Mata, "understand by logic an instrument of speech, kalam, whereby sound speech is distinguished from unsound and wrong meaning, mana, from right. Like a balance, for thereby I know overweight from underweight and what rises from what sinks." And third quote, "Logic is the investigation of the intentions, awrad, understood by reason, and meanings, ma'ani, comprehended thereby, and the investigation of ideas, khawatir, that come to mind, and notions, sawanih, that crop up." For our purposes, it is neither interesting whether or not Tawhidi's presentation faithfully captures Mata's concept of logic, nor how exactly we ought to interpret these descriptions in their own right. Rather, for us, it is important to note how Sirafi dashes at them and undermines the specific phrasing Mata has utilized in order to develop his own theory of language and its relation to thought. For this end, I've highlighted in bold letters those elements that serve Sirafi as an inroad for his rebuttal of Mata. For one, he immediately seizes the link that Mata establishes between logic, a tool meant to distinguish truth from falsehood, and language, when he defines logic as an instrument of speech, kalam, in the second statement. And moreover, Sirafi makes use of the distinction between two layers of language that Mata obviously acknowledges in neat accordance with the Aristotelian tradition. The distinction between lafz and ma'na, between vocal sound and meaning. To be clear, Sirafi does not deny the possibility to distinguish between lafz and ma'na. He does so himself, so it's a useful tool. However, as I intend to show, his concepts of lafz and ma'na, and along with them, of language and thought, profoundly differ from those of matter and the Falasifa. They belong to a distinct conceptual framework that demarcates concepts along entirely different lines. Now, Sirafi's immediate reply to Matar's second description of logic introduces an important first differentiation. I quote, so his reply is, "You're mistaken, for sound speech, kalam, is distinguished from unsound by virtue of the familiar arrangement, nazm, and known declension, i'rab, if we speak Arabic, and wrong meaning, ma'na, from right, by means of reason, aql, if we investigate with reason," unquote. On the one hand, Sirafi maintains that the soundness of speech, kalam, is assessed by grammar by means of linguistic signs that indicate the relations between the various elements of which speech consists. So this is the reference to declension, i'rab, but also to arrangement, nazm, which would be syntax. This is to say, he takes the term speech, kalam, to refer to the level of vocal sound, of lafz. On the other hand, Sirafi insists that the correctness of meaning, of ma'na, the semantic level of language, is considered by means of reason, of aql, an entity that Sirafi obviously opposes to the sphere of logic and its activities. This second observation is remarkable, and from the point of view of Falsafa, is basically incomprehensible, as Matar's third description of logic above suggested, where he distinguished between the aghrad, the intentions, and the ideas, the khawatir, that we have in mind. And so this is for him too the place of our inner life, of the ma'ani. So for him it's incomprehensible. A philosopher like Matar would doubtlessly agree with Sirafi that we distinguish right from wrong by means of reason, by means of aql. However, he would insist that this boils down to applying logic. This astonishing distinction between reason on the one hand and logic on the other leads us to the core of Sirafi's and the Udaba's conception of language and thought, their notions of ma'ana and aql. As I will argue, aql, humanity's faculty to assess ma'ana, as Sirafi is convinced, cannot be associated with logic, but instead must be explained in accordance with the adab tradition as an entity that is and must be linguistically informed in order to perform its function. That is, in order to perform thinking and understanding, to be able at all to think and understand. To bring out Sirafi's profoundly non-Aristotelian conception, both of aql and of its object, ma'na, and as a consequence of language and thought, we need to make a small digression before we can return to the debate. This digression directs us to the already mentioned Abu Uthman al-Jahil and the conceptual DNA of the Udaba's notion of language. So let's continue with Jahil. Jahil is not only considered one of the architects of adab, and this is why I refer to the DNA of adab and their notion of language. So he's not only one of the architects of adab, he was probably the first Arabic thinker who developed, among other things, a genuine philosophy of language. Yet this philosophy of language cannot be isolated from other questions he pursued, and most importantly, from his metaphysical theological presuppositions, which were strongly influenced by his Muslim background. In general, we should conceive of Jahil as a thinker intrigued, highly intrigued by the human being as such, its nature, purpose, and challenges. On his account, humanity's distinctive feature is nutq, a notoriously ambiguous term signifying both the capacity to speak and to think, quite comparable to the Greek logos. With this unique feature, Jahil believed, humanity was created by God and held a specific place within the world, itself likewise a divine product. As part and parcel of this thoroughly divine setting, humans were expected to pursue a certain goal, namely redemption in the world to come as remuneration for an appropriate conduct of life in this world. And last but not least, Jarith was convinced that God had equipped human beings with the necessary means to comprehend the constitution of the world and its own duties. This necessary means now, according to Jarith, was none other than humanity's specific difference, that is, nutq. It is obvious that, embedded in such a worldview, humanity's capacity to speak an eo ipso language as the realization of this capacity turn into highly charged concepts. They are located exactly at the intersection of Jarith's metaphysical, theological framework and the, so to speak, profane level of everyday human language. And it is precisely at this intersection that we will hit upon the key to Sirafi's notion of aql and mana. Jarith's most detailed treatment of human language can be found in his Kitab al-Bayan, which I translate as On Conspicuousness, a book that has a much broader scope than just human language. There, Jarith develops a comprehensive semiotics, distinguishing no less than 5 kinds of sign, only one of which, namely lafz, linguistic expression, is directly related to human language. These 5 kinds are, in addition to lafz, indication or indexing, ishara, and writing, khat, plus 2 further kinds which I leave untranslated for the moment, namely nusba, a state that signifies hal dal, as Jarith vaguely adumbrates upon its introduction, and aqt, usually translated as finger count in modern research. While the first 3 types of sign plainly belong to the human sphere and, for our purposes, are sufficiently self-explanatory, the last 2 types are related to Jarith's metaphysical theological framework and require clarification. The most comprehensive kind of sign is the nusba, described in the Kitab al-Bayan as follows, I quote, "The nusba is a state that speaks, natika, without linguistic expressions, and indicates, mushira, without a hand. It is apparent in the creation of the heavens and the earth, in whatever is mute and speaking, inanimate and growing, permanent and transient, excessive and wanting. The sign, dalala, that is in an inanimate, lifeless thing is just like the sign that is in a speaking, living being," unquote. Notably, the nusba is depicted in terms borrowed from the human sphere, but immediately distinguished from the latter. Just like a sign, a dalala, in human communication, the nusba speaks and indicates. However, it does so by making use of a different medium. Instead of lafz, ishara, and we may infer khat, its bearer is the entire world. Is the entire world every part of God's creation, regardless of animate or inanimate, eternal or temporary. Literally every single atom, according to this presentation, is part and parcel of the nusba and therefore speaks, is nautic or nautica. The idea that the entire world in and of itself is a sign offering guidance to humanity, instructing it about the creator and about its own place within creation, was not Jarith's invention. Rather, it is a conviction expressed by the Quran itself. Jarith obviously thought of the respective verses, because he cites several of them as he continues and introduces the other uncommon type of sign, the aqt. Aqt is closely related to nusba. Jarith explains it as calculation without linguistic expression and writing. So calculation, hisab, without lafz and khat. Thus, like the nusba, he discriminates it from the kinds of sign prevailing in the human realm, but this time he puts the emphasis on another aspect, the act does not speak or indicate, but calculate, which is to say, as a sign, it has a different function. To elucidate what he has in mind, Jahid cites from the Quran, among other places from Surat Al-An'am, according to which God has made the sun and moon for calculation, for husban, which is a related term, as you see. The sun and the moon, as well as other stars or the seasons, the sun and the moon as means for calculation. This is the recurring motive that unifies the verses quoted from the Quran with Jahid's own remarks on Aqd, and it provides the link with Nusba. For the sun and the moon, themselves constitutive elements of the Nusba, as we have seen, were created by God, and this is another Quranic quote that Jahid gives, they were created by God that you may know the number of years and account of time, you being we, us, the human beings. The knowledge that the knowledge meant here cannot be reduced to chronometry is underscored by Jahid himself, who in his own voice adds, I quote, if human beings did not have knowledge of the meaning of calculation in this world, truly they would not understand with respect to God, his powerful and exalted, the meaning of calculation of the world to come, unquote. The sun and the moon, as we have seen, belong to God's all-embracing semiotic system, the Nusba, and as such speak of and indicate their divine origin. Additionally, however, they facilitate calculation in this world. And it is this calculation, or rather the meaning, the ma'na it has in this world, that functions as a sign in its own right, namely as Aqd. It is a sign of the divine calculation of the world to come. In other words, by virtue of the divine algorithm, the divine hisab, determining the movements of the celestial bodies, and thus bringing about their effects such as the seasons, so all these rhythmic kinds of structures. So by virtue of the divine hisab, Aqd guides humanity to the eschatological signification of the order underlying the world. Now, implanted and entangled in this metaphysical and eschatological sign system is the human being, with its own distinctive capacity to speak, indicate, and write, as a reference to the three other kinds of signs. Yet, in contrast to the divine message conveyed by the Nusba, which is apparent in the entire creation, apparent zahir, this was the term Jahid used in the respective quotation. So in contrast to the Nusba, which is apparent in the entire creation, humanity's ma'ani are not. While in creation, everything literally embodies what God meant to express. The divine sign is its message. In the human sphere, there is an insurmountable ontological gap between sign and meaning. Ma'ani inhabit one's mind, whereas the signs, the alfaz, regardless of whether spoken or written, reside in extramental reality. Ma'ani are invisible and hidden. Alfaz, by contrast, physical and sense perceptible. Moreover, and this, I believe, is the decisive factor, ma'ani are spread out infinitely and extended without end. Whereas names, here in the quotation, and this is to say alfaz, so here we are on the level of the alfaz, names are confined and limited in number. As experts of the Aristotelian tradition, we may run the risk of partially misreading this claim. We may exclusively associate it with the beginning of the categories and the problem of equivocity, since there are, at least potentially, an infinite number of concepts, but, as a matter of fact, only a finite number of sounds. Every linguistic community will be forced to posit some of their words not only for one, but several, semantically often unrelated things, like dog as a sign for both the animal, bellow, and the constellation, so the astronomical constellation. While this is an issue Jyth definitely also has in mind here, it is not what he primarily aims for. The chief problem is instead the fact, as he sees it, that ma'ani are extended without end, while alfaz are confined. That is, they are demarcated, delineated. To fully grasp what he means to say, we must realize the interplay of lafz and mana on Jyth's account. How do alfaz actually signify their ma'ani? Meanings are invisible and hidden in one's mind, like behind a curtain. In order to make them visible to someone else, we must somehow remove this curtain. According to Jyth's theory, we do so by means of alfaz, which, however, due to their confined nature, succeed only in part. To stick to our metaphor, they cut out holes into the curtain and thus disclose the meanings hidden behind it. Meanwhile, in this manner, they reveal only what is located within the confines of these holes. Whatever extends beyond those panes cannot be captured by them. As a consequence, humanity's grasp of the ma'ani, themselves the result of God's creation and of his eternal speech act, humanity's grasp of the ma'ani will always remain incomplete. It will be constituted by a greater or smaller number of holes in a curtain, of holes that uncover only a more or less considerable number of the ma'ani out there, and in a more or less appropriate or congruous manner. At this point, I believe, we have identified the essential features of Jyth's philosophy of language. The capacity to speak and think, nutq, is a gift with which God endowed humanity to decipher the world, itself an all-encompassing signpost, the nusba, conveying in the first place God's metaphysical, theological, and at the same time eschatological message. This is to say that the ma'ani are, as I just put it, out there. They are expressed by the things themselves, or rather, they are embodied by the things. Everything in the world has meaning. By means of its linguistic capacity now, humanity is called upon to seize these ma'ani. However, to do so, humans must coin and employ alfaz, the most efficient tools at their disposal to capture and convey the meanings they seek to grasp. Understanding, therefore, on Jyth's account, is and must be a linguistic enterprise. For him, it is not based on concepts impressed on the soul by extramental things and then communicated through labels or name tags attached to these concepts, as the philosopher believe. Although Jyth would agree that understanding is an activity of reason, of aql, for him and the udaba, it consists in the attempt to get hold of the ma'ani out there by means of the alfaz at one's disposal, which is to say, by way of one's native language, and hence through the conceptual framework this language offers, through the holes it cuts into the semantic curtain. With this conception of language and thought, we are in a position to return to the debate between Sirafi and Mata, and thus to Tawhidi's concept of language and thought. Wrong mana is distinguished from right by means of aql and not of logic. Sirafi noted before we left our digression, 4-hour digression, and this is the quote we saw last before we left. Dwelling on this idea, he now adds that the capability to grasp mana and to distinguish wrong meaning from right depends on the specific rational capacities with which one was born, and hence cannot be improved artificially, for instance, by way of an external tool like logic. Instead of logic, however, there is a link between reason and language. And this is due to the nature of language, which, however, in Sirafi's view, decisively differs from what the Aristotelians held it to be. As he argues, zooming in on the relation between lafz and ma'na, I quote, "The difference between linguistic expression, lafz, and meaning, ma'na, is that lafz is natural, tabi'i, and ma'na rational, aqli. Therefore, lafz perishes over time because time replaces the trace of nature by virtue of another trace of nature. And therefore, ma'na remains over time because it is reason, aql, that records it. Reason, however, is divine, whereas the matter of which lafz consists is physical, tiniya, and whatever is physical dissolves." Unquote. In this passage, Sirafi distinguishes between natural, tabi'i, and rational, aqli. Accordingly, linguistic expressions are natural, while ma'ani are rational. Note, however, that he uses the term natural, as the rest of this citation shows, not in the sense of inborn or innate, what it could likewise mean, but rather as a synonym of physical, of tini. More precisely, of a specific feature every physical object is subject to, namely corruption and dissolution. This ephemeral constitution of lafz is contrasted with the durability of ma'na, which inhabits a fundamentally different realm. It belongs to the sphere of reason, aql, and this is the decisive factor, it remains over time because reason is divine. Here we have reached a point where the metaphysics of language developed by Jahid plainly comes to the fore. For the latter, as we've seen, ma'ani are of a unique nature. They are divine. They are embodied by the things God created and can be captured only insufficiently by virtue of human language, because alfaz and ma'ani are incommensurable. Sirafi's philosophy of language is driven precisely by this assumption of an insurmountable ontological chasm between lafz and ma'ana, as we can see here. Concluding his argument concerning the distinction between logic on the one hand and reason cum meaning on the other, he challenges matter with the following thought experiment. I quote, "Tell me, supposing someone were to say to you, in respect to knowledge of the truth, its search and its investigation, my condition is similar to that of those who lived before the inventor, the Wadia of logic," that is Aristotle. "I study like them and deliberate like them, for I know the language by birth and inheritance, and I picked up the meanings by study and reflection, scrutiny, and industry. What would you answer him?" Unquote. For our topic, Sirafi's notion of logic as such is not of primary interest. However, what he introduces as its counterpart is a situation completely unaffected by the toolkit Aristotelian logic has to offer, and a search for truth without the influence of the organon, so to speak, humanity's original position with regard to the application of reason and the acquisition of knowledge. This state must be described in purely linguistic terms on his account. It is only due to language, the language one knows by birth and inheritance, as he says here, that one is in a position to search and investigate. This is a bold claim. For one, Sirafi gives us to understand that applying one's reason, aql, to the extent one's own inborn powers permit, is the only avenue to attain to the ma'ani as closely as possible. Moreover, the limits and shortcomings one experiences as one seeks for knowledge are imposed not only by one's own individual givens, but also, and perhaps primarily, by the concepts one's native language shapes. This idea is particularly manifest in the concluding part of our quotation, where Sirafi talks about first language acquisition and the formation of one's conceptual matrix. Basically, he presents them as one and the same process. I quote again, "I know the language by birth and inheritance, and I picked up the meanings by study and reflection." Unquote. In other words, we are born into our native languages and cannot help but forming our human concepts within them, in accordance with their principles and categories as we grow up. In unison with Jahith and the Adab tradition, Sirafi seems to be convinced that it is through language that we build up our understanding of the world, that we grasp the ma'ani out there. The result of study and reflection, he insists, are the very meanings, ma'ani, conveyed or captured by one's native language. For him, as already for Jahith, there is no autonomous sphere of human concepts preceding language. There cannot be a single thought without and independent of language, since thought is relative to language. As indicated above, it is this distinctly non-Aristotelian notion of the linguistic nature of thought which explains Sirafi's reaction to Matta's definitions of logic. Accordingly, we distinguish wrong meaning from right by means of reason and not of logic. We are now in a position to add, and this is the quote, the reaction to the second definition of logic that we saw above. So it is, we distinguish wrong meaning from right by means of reason and not of logic. Meanings can be known and assessed only by virtue of one's divine tool, aql, within the limits imposed on every human being by their own rational gifts, and solely through the lens of the language into which one was born and the conceptual framework this language provides. There are a number of essential features that distinguish this specific conception of language and thought from that of the Falasifa. As a conclusion to my paper, I would like to highlight some of them briefly, taking the list of issues that I presented as a summary at the end of the section on Falsafa as a loose guideline. So if you want to scroll back to compare, there is some loose match between these 5 points. First, words or languages, the Falasifa maintain, are particularly and arbitrary because they are posited by linguistic communities. While the Udaba would agree that words, alfaz, are indeed particular, they would deny that they are fully arbitrary. To them, alfaz are motivated by the ma'ani they are designed to capture. And in order to do so, they must cover their ma'ani as accurately as possible. I did not have the time to go into this in my talk, but there were thinkers during the formative period who developed highly sophisticated theories of how the alfaz, their constitutive elements, morphology, and syntax, of how they are motivated and, as a consequence, more or less successful in performing their function, that is, attain to the ma'ani. Second, Falasifa believe that concepts literally represent or are images of extramental reality, because there are imprints or traces of things perceived. Udaba, in contrast, hold that concepts are linguistically shaped. They are the result of first language acquisition. Understanding, therefore, to considerable extent depends on the language one was born into. Third, for the Falasifa, concepts are primary, while words are instituted secondarily as vehicles to transmit thought. From the perspective of the Udaba, this idea is absurd. On their account, we need language so as to grasp anything at all and to think. The concepts in our minds are the result of our acquisition of language, providing the lens through which we perceive the world. Fourth, as we have seen, Falasifa distinguish between 3 kinds of ma'ana or ma'ani: linguistic, conceptual, and real or metaphysical. For the Udaba, however, there are only 2 levels of ma'ani: those that are out there, that is the ones God created, and those that we nourish, that God created on the one hand, and on the other hand, those that we nourish in our minds, that is the ones that our languages allow us to capture by means of its alpha. In other words, the distinction between linguistic and conceptual mana collapses in the other model, just as the distinction between language and thought. Fifth, as a consequence, the respective notions of signification differ considerably. For the philosopher, linguistic expressions signify, by way of their meanings, corresponding things in extramental reality. Language is considered exclusively in its apophantic dimension, as the comparison with logic or of logic with a balance indicates. Accordingly, the philosopher defend a purely extensional concept of signification. For the Udaba, in contrast, linguistic expressions are tailored to signify ma'ani out there, meanings created by God, meanings that constitute his message to humanity. It is all these semantic shades of the human message, human knowledge and understanding by way of language is meant to fathom. I think it is not exaggerated to maintain that both conceptions of language and thought differ fundamentally. Perhaps the most striking distinction consists in the last mentioned fact that the Udaba look at language not from the reduced angle of the philosopher interested in language only in its apophantic dimension, and insofar as it is a necessary, inevitable medium to do logic, namely to express and then to assess propositions. Instead, the Udaba take language in all its facets, its informative as well as performative functions, its cognitive as well as social dimensions, etc. It is, among other things, for this reason, also I believe, that the Udaba's philosophy of language so profoundly differs from that of the philosopher and advances into so many more directions. To flesh them out, however, would be the topic for another series of lectures. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions, remarks, and comments, at least of those of you who attend the lecture on Tuesday. Thank you very much.